My name is Maya Whitfield. I'm 34 years old, and 9 years ago my mother stood in my parents' living room and told me that if I married David, I would no longer be her daughter. She didn't yell it. She said it the way you'd read a weather report. Calm, final, already decided before I walked in the room. Last Tuesday, she stood on my front porch in a coat I didn't recognize, holding a folded piece of paper, and asked me to come home for Thanksgiving. She had a list. 4 items. She read them to me like an agenda before I'd even said hello. 9 years of silence. Not a birthday card. Not a phone call when my father had his knee surgery, which I only found out about from a cousin on Facebook. 9 Christmases where I sat at a table that was just David and me and, eventually, our son Theo, while 3 states away my family gathered in the house I grew up in and pretended I didn't exist. And then 2 weeks ago, David's company went public. By Friday afternoon, our combined net worth on paper was $44 million. By Monday morning, my mother had found my address. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. Quiet stories about people who stopped shrinking themselves for families that never deserved the space they took up. If you've ever been told you weren't welcome until you became useful, this one is for you. Drop a comment and subscribe so the next story finds you. Let me take you back to where this actually started, long before the money, long before the company, back to a spring afternoon in a small colonial-style house in Ridgefield, Connecticut, where I told my parents I'd met someone. I grew up in Ridgefield in a house with white shutters and a lawn my father mowed in perfectly straight lines every Saturday morning, weather permitting. My father, Robert Whitfield, worked in commercial insurance underwriting for almost 30 years at the same firm. My mother, Patricia, didn't work outside the home after I was born. She ran the house, the church calendar, and, more than anything, the family's reputation, with the same discipline other people bring to a full-time job. I have one older brother, Grant. Grant was captain of the lacrosse team, went to Bowdoin, and by the time he was 30 had a corner office at a regional bank and a wife named Caroline who coordinated seasonal centerpieces for every holiday. Grant was, by every visible measure, exactly what my parents had ordered. I was the quieter one. I studied graphic design, which my mother described at dinner parties as Maya's little art thing, and I worked, at the time all of this started, as a brand designer for a mid-size agency in Stamford. I wasn't rebellious. I didn't come home with piercings or tattoos or opinions my parents found alarming. I came home, mostly, with silence because silence was easier than being measured against Grant and Caroline and coming up short in ways nobody ever said out loud but everybody understood. There was a specific tone in my house, one I didn't have a name for until I was older. It wasn't loud prejudice. Nobody in my family would have used a slur at the dinner table. They would have been horrified at the suggestion.
It was quieter than that.
It was the way my mother described a black family that moved into the neighborhood in 2009 as very nice, surprisingly. It was the way my father, watching the news, would say, well, I'm sure it's more complicated than that whenever a story involved race and he hadn't fully thought it through. It was the particular silence that fell over the table whenever the subject came anywhere near itself. I remember one incident specifically from when I was maybe 15. Our church ran a youth mission trip every summer, and the year I'm thinking of, the trip partnered with a congregation in a mostly black neighborhood 2 towns over on a community center painting project. My mother signed the permission slip without comment, but I overheard her on the phone with a friend that same week, describing the trip as a really valuable experience for Maya, exposure to a different world, the way you describe a study abroad program to a country you didn't especially respect. I didn't understand, at 15, what exactly bothered me about that sentence. I understand it completely now. My mother wasn't opposed to me knowing black people existed. She was opposed to the idea that any of them might ever be considered equal to us, might ever sit at our table as something other than a lesson in exposure. I didn't examine any of it closely until I met David, because until I met David, none of it had ever been pointed directly at someone I loved. I met David Coleman in November of 2015 at a mutual friend's birthday dinner in New Haven. He was finishing his master's in mechanical engineering at Yale, working nights on a robotics side project with 2 classmates in a lab that smelled like solder and burnt coffee. He talked about torque and actuator design with the same unguarded enthusiasm most people reserve for talking about their kids, and I remember thinking, before I even knew his last name, that I wanted to hear him talk about anything for the rest of my life. David grew up in Hartford, raised by his mother, Denise, who worked 2 jobs, days as a hospital billing coordinator, evenings doing alterations out of the house, to keep him in a magnet school with a real engineering track. His father wasn't in the picture. He had one younger sister, Aisha, whom he'd half-raised himself while his mother worked. He got into Yale on a mix of scholarships and loans he was still paying off the year we met. Everything he had, he'd built with almost no cushion underneath him. We dated for 8 months before I brought him home. I want to be honest about why it took that long. Some of it was logistics. My parents were 3 hours away, and David's schedule was brutal. But some of it, if I'm being fully honest with you and with myself, was that some small cowardly part of me was already bracing for how it would go, and I kept finding reasons to delay finding out I was right. When I finally brought him to Ridgefield for a Sunday dinner in July of 2016, my mother was polite in the specific, brittle way she reserved for people she'd already decided not to like. She asked him where he was from originally, which is a question white families in towns like mine ask black people and almost never ask white people, and when he said Hartford, she said, "Oh, how interesting," in a tone that suggested it was not interesting to her at all. My father shook his hand, asked him one question about his robotics work, didn't listen to the answer, and spent the rest of dinner talking to Grant about the Yankees. Grant was fine, actually distant but not unkind. It was my parents who made the air in that dining room feel like it had been vacuum sealed. In the car afterward, David didn't say much. I asked him if he was okay. He looked out the window for a while before he answered. "I've had that dinner before, Maya," he said. "Different house, different china, same dinner." I didn't fully understand what he meant that night. I would understand it completely within 2 years. David proposed in the spring of 2018 in the parking lot of the lab where he'd finished his master's and was now working 80-hour weeks on the beginnings of what would become his company, a small robotics startup he and his 2 co-founders named Vantage Dynamics. He didn't have a fancy ring. He had a small opal, because I'd once mentioned I liked opals better than diamonds, and he'd apparently remembered that for 2 years. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I called my mother that same night, still giddy, still certain that whatever coolness I'd felt at that first dinner was something that would soften with time, the way I told myself these things always softened. My mother was quiet on the phone for a long moment. Then she said, "Are you sure this is what you want, Maya? Have you really thought about what your life is going to look like?" I asked her what she meant. She said, carefully, the way she chose every difficult word, "I just mean it's a big decision. There are things you two won't have in common. Cultural things. It's not a judgment, honey. It's just realistic." I hung up the phone and sat on the edge of my bed for a long time before I told David what she'd said. When I did, he wasn't surprised. That was the part that stayed with me, not the words themselves, which stung plenty, but the fact that David had clearly been expecting some version of them for years, from families exactly like mine, and had simply been waiting to see how bad mine would be. Over the following months, the objections became slightly more specific, always delivered in that same reasonable, concerned voice. My mother worried about what people would think. She worried about how hard it would be for children, hypothetical children we hadn't even discussed yet. She mentioned, more than once, a family friend's daughter who'd gone through something similar and how difficult it had been for everyone, as though David and I were a cautionary tale she was trying to spare me from becoming. My father said less, but his silence functioned as agreement. He never once, in all those months, said a single word in David's defense. Grant, to his credit, told me privately that he thought David was a good guy and that Mom needed to get over herself. He never said it in front of her. In my family, private decency and public silence were treated as basically the same thing, and for a long time I let them be. There was one dinner, about 4 months before the wedding, that I still think about more than almost any other. My father's cousin Ellen was visiting from out of state, and my mother had organized a small family gathering, the kind where everyone performs a version of themselves slightly more polished than they actually are. David came. He'd brought a bottle of wine he'd researched carefully for weeks beforehand, wanting to get it right, wanting, I think, to be seen making an effort in a house that had made none in return. Halfway through dinner, Ellen, who didn't know the specifics of what my mother had already said to me in private, asked David and me, brightly, and without any apparent awareness of the landmine she was stepping on, when we were planning to have children, and whether we'd thought about how that would work with everything. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. My mother's face went very still. The particular stillness of someone watching a conversation had somewhere she'd rather it not go in front of witnesses. David answered smoothly, the way he always did in rooms like that, with a joke that let everyone laugh and move on. I watched him do it, watched him absorb the discomfort of the entire table and convert it into something easier for everyone else to swallow, and I remember feeling something crack open in me that never fully closed again, a recognition that this was going to be the pattern, indefinitely, unless something changed. We set a date for October 2018, a small wedding at a restored barn venue in Litchfield County, 60 guests, David's mother and sister on one side, my extended family scattered through the other, or so we planned. 3 weeks before the wedding, my mother called and asked to meet me for coffee alone, without David. I should have known from the tone of her voice, which had the particular calm of someone who has rehearsed something in front of a mirror. We met at a diner near my apartment. She ordered tea she didn't drink. She told me that she and my father had talked it over, at length, and that they weren't able to attend the wedding. She used the word able, not willing, as though it were a logistical impossibility rather than a choice. When I asked her why, she finally said the sentence that I would carry with me for the next 9 years. David is a good person, Maya. I'm not saying he isn't, but he isn't one of us. And if you marry him, you're choosing a life we can't be part of. I asked her what one of us meant. She wouldn't answer directly. She talked instead about the family, about what your grandparents built, about the community, a word she used the way some people use a legal term, as though it settled the matter simply by being invoked. What she meant, underneath all of it, was exactly what it sounded like. David wasn't white, and in my mother's ledger, that single fact outweighed 9 years of him working 2 jobs worth of hours to build something from nothing, outweighed the fact that he'd never once raised his voice at me, outweighed the fact that he made me laugh in a way no one else in my life ever had. I got up from that table before my coffee was finished. I remember my hands were shaking, not from anger exactly, but from the particular vertigo of watching a person you've loved your whole life reveal something in themselves you'd spent years refusing to look at directly. If you've ever had a parent explain away prejudice as realism or concern, you already know exactly what that diner felt like. Subscribe and stay with me, because the wedding is only the beginning of what my family was willing to lose. My father called 2 days later. I thought, for one hopeful minute, that he might be calling to apologize on behalf of both of them, or, at least to say, he'd be coming regardless of what my mother decided. Instead, he told me, in a voice that sounded almost apologetic about its own cowardice, that he wasn't going to go against your mother on this one, Maya. He said it the way you described declining to get involved in an argument between 2 coworkers. Not his fight.
Not his choice to make.
Grant came. He was the only one. He stood up as a groomsman, danced with our great-aunt, and at one point during the reception pulled me aside and told me quietly that he was ashamed of our parents and that I shouldn't spend one more minute of my life waiting for them to come around. I appreciated it. I also noticed that his shame didn't stop him from going back to Ridgefield for Thanksgiving that same year, sitting at the same table as our parents, and never once bringing up what they'd done. David's mother, Denise, walked him down the aisle, wearing a lavender dress she'd sewn herself. His sister Aisha gave a toast that made half the room cry. It was, in every way that actually mattered, one of the best days of my life. But there is a particular kind of grief that lives underneath even your happiest days when the people who raised you have decided, in writing and in absence, that the person you love disqualifies you from their love in return. I carried that grief quietly through the whole reception, smiling in every photo, because I'd already decided that my family's absence wasn't going to be allowed to own that day too. I want to tell you honestly that I cut my parents off in one clean, decisive moment, the kind of scene that would look good in a movie. That isn't what happened. What happened was slower and messier and lasted about 18 months before it hardened into something permanent. For the first year after the wedding, I still called my mother on her birthday. I still sent a card at Christmas, a card she never once acknowledged. I still, in the quiet, humiliating way that people who've been raised to keep the peace often do, left the door cracked open, telling myself that time would do the work forgiveness apparently couldn't. The thing that finally closed the door wasn't a single dramatic event. It was an accumulation. It was my mother sending a baby gift for Grant and Caroline's daughter, addressed with a handwritten note about how excited she was to be a grandmother, the same month David and I found out I was pregnant with our son, Theo, news I had shared with her over the phone, and which she had responded to with a long pause and the words, "Well, I hope you two have thought this through." It was finding out, secondhand, through a cousin's social media post, that my parents had traveled to Grants for Easter while I sat 3 states away, 8 months pregnant, having received no invitation at all. Theo was born in March of 2020, 3 weeks before the world shut down for the pandemic. My mother did not call. She did not send a gift. She found out he existed, I later learned, through the same cousin's Facebook page, 3 months after he was born. I want to describe that particular week for you, because I think it's the part of the story that shaped everything that came after more than any single dramatic confrontation ever could. I was recovering from an emergency C-section, alone with a newborn while David split his attention between 2-hour feeding windows and a company that was, at that exact moment, trying to figure out how to keep 3 employees paid through a pandemic that had frozen half its client contracts overnight. Denise came the second the hospital allowed visitors, masked, gloved, carrying a casserole she'd made at midnight because she couldn't sleep from excitement. My own mother, 90 minutes away by car, sent nothing. Not a card. Not a call. Nothing for 3 months, until a cousin's post finally forced her hand into a single, brief text that read only, "Congratulations, I suppose." I have never been able to fully explain to anyone outside my own head what those 2 words did to something in my chest that had been holding on quietly for almost 2 years by that point. That was the moment I finally stopped leaving the door cracked. I didn't send an angry letter. I didn't post anything online. I simply stopped reaching out, stopped sending cards, stopped including her in the small, ordinary updates of my life. If she wanted a relationship with her grandson, the address hadn't moved. She knew exactly where to find us. She never did. Not for 9 years. Not for Theo's first steps, his first day of kindergarten, his 5th birthday, the year he lost his front tooth and insisted on keeping it in a little box shaped like a robot that David built for him. 9 years of silence from the woman who once told me she couldn't wait to be a grandmother, back when the grandchild she was imagining looked the way she'd expected. My father sent exactly 1 email in those 9 years, in 2021, 3 sentences long, saying he hoped we were doing well and that he thought about us. I read it a dozen times, looking for an apology hidden somewhere in it. There wasn't one. I never replied. If you've ever waited for an apology that never came and quietly built a life anyway, tell me in the comments how long you waited before you stopped. And subscribe, because what my family did next is the reason this story exists. While my parents were making Easter plans without me, David was in a rented warehouse in New Haven with his 2 co-founders, building the earliest prototype of what would become Vantage Dynamics' flagship product, a compact robotic arm system designed for small manufacturing operations that couldn't afford the massive industrial robotics that only large factories could justify. The idea was simple in concept and brutally hard in execution. Make precision robotics affordable and modular enough for a machine shop with 15 employees, not just a plant with 1,500. Those early years were not glamorous. I worked full-time at the design agency, while David drew no salary for the first 2 years of the company's life, living instead on savings on my income and on a series of small grants and one very patient angel investor named Priya Anand, who believed in the product before almost anyone else did. There were months we genuinely didn't know if we'd make rent. I remember one January where David sold his father's old watch, the one thing he had left from a man he barely knew, just to cover payroll for his 2 employees that month. He never told them. He told me 2 years later, almost as an aside, and I had to leave the room for a minute. I want to be clear about something, because it matters to the rest of this story. Nobody handed David anything. There was no family money cushioning any of this. His mother, Denise, worked until she was 68 partly because David insisted on paying off the last of her mortgage the first year the company turned a real profit, and even then she kept working another 2 years because, she told me once, she didn't know how to stop. There's a specific memory from those early years that I've never fully told anyone outside of David himself, because it isn't mine to tell casually. In 2019, David and Priya flew out to pitch a group of potential investors in Boston, a room full of men who controlled the kind of capital that could have changed the company's trajectory overnight. David walked in prepared down to the decimal point, having rehearsed the technical portions of the pitch until he could deliver them in his sleep. Afterward, one of the investors, a man David had researched carefully and respected professionally, pulled him aside and told him, not unkindly, that he just didn't see a guy like you as the face of a hardware company investors trust with 8 figures. Not the product, not the numbers. A guy like you. David didn't tell me that story for almost a year. When he finally did, it wasn't with anger. It was with the flat, practiced calm of someone who had absorbed that exact sentence, in different words, more times than he could count, and had simply learned to keep walking anyway. He didn't get that investor's money. He got Priya's instead, and 11 other smaller checks from people willing to bet on the actual engineering rather than their own assumptions about who was allowed to build it. It took 2 years longer than it might have otherwise. He never once let it slow him down in front of me, though I know now it cost him something every single time. By 2022, Vantage Dynamics had signed contracts with a dozen mid-sized manufacturers across the Northeast. By 2024, they'd expanded into the Midwest and secured a partnership with a major automotive supplier that needed exactly the kind of flexible, affordable robotics David and his team had spent years building. Revenue, which had been essentially theoretical for the first 4 years, crossed $11 million in 2024 and was projected north of $30 million for 2025. I remember the exact week things started to feel different, because it was the same week Theo turned 3. David had been chasing a contract with a mid-sized furniture manufacturer in Ohio for almost 8 months, flying out for meetings he paid for out of pocket, sleeping in a Hampton Inn near the plant so he could walk the factory floor himself instead of sending someone else to do it. The company's engineers kept telling him the same thing every competitor had told him, that what he was proposing was too ambitious for the price point, that nobody built precision robotics that cheap without cutting corners somewhere. He came home from that final Ohio trip at almost midnight, and I remember he didn't say a word at first. He just set his bag down by the door, walked into Theo's room, and stood there for a long time watching our son sleep. When he finally came to bed, he told me they'd signed. Not a small pilot contract, either a full production agreement, the kind that would let him hire 6 more engineers and finally, after 4 years, pay himself something close to a normal salary. I bring this up because I want you to understand what $9 million of eventual annual revenue actually cost to build. It cost a father's watch. It cost 100 flights in economy middle seats. It cost holidays where David worked through dinner because a client in a different time zone needed a call. It cost years where date night meant splitting a rotisserie chicken at our kitchen table after Theo went to bed because that was what the budget allowed. None of that showed up in the IPO headline. None of it showed up in the number my mother eventually read on her phone. But it was the actual substance of everything that number represented, and my family had been 3 states away, uninterested, for every single hour of it. None of this happened where my family could see it, because my family had made it clear they weren't looking. I didn't send updates. I didn't post triumphant announcements. I raised Theo, worked my own job, and watched my husband build something remarkable through sheer stubborn will, all while 3 states away, the people who'd once told him he wasn't one of us went on with their lives as though we didn't exist. The decision to take Vantage Dynamics public wasn't sudden. David and his co-founders had spent the better part of 18 months preparing for it, working with underwriters, refining the offering, going through the exhausting choreography of investor roadshows and regulatory filings that I mostly experienced secondhand, through David coming home late and falling asleep at the kitchen table with his laptop still open. The company went public on a Friday morning in late September. I wasn't at the exchange. David was, along with his co-founders, watching a screen that translated 7 years of 80-hour weeks into a number. By the closing bell, Vantage Dynamics' market capitalization had settled at just over $310 million. David and I, between his founder shares and the vesting structure his lawyers had negotiated years earlier, were suddenly, on paper, worth $44 million. I want to tell you it felt triumphant. Mostly, it felt strange. We sat at our kitchen table that night, the same table where he'd once told me about selling his father's watch, and neither of us said much for a long time. Theo, 5 years old, drew a picture of Daddy's robot and taped it to the refrigerator, entirely unaware that his father's robot company had just changed the shape of our lives. The news made it into a few trade publications and one short segment on a regional business news channel, the kind of coverage that wouldn't normally reach 3 separate states of extended family who had spent 9 years not looking. But it reached them anyway because someone always looks eventually, and in my family's case, the someone was my mother, scrolling through a local news app 3 states away and stumbling across a headline with her son-in-law's name in it, next to a number with 8 figures. She showed up on a Tuesday afternoon, 11 days after the IPO, in a car I didn't recognize, wearing a wool coat I'd never seen. I opened the door because I hadn't yet processed who was standing on my porch. It had genuinely been long enough that my brain needed a second to catch up to my eyes. "Maya," she said, like it hadn't been 9 years, like she'd seen me last Tuesday. I was hoping we could talk. I let her in, mostly out of shock and mostly because I wanted to see exactly how far she was willing to go, the way you sometimes let a bad diagnosis finish explaining itself before you decide how to respond. She sat on my couch, in my house, in the life she had refused to acknowledge for nearly a decade, and pulled a folded piece of paper out of her purse. She unfolded it like an agenda. I watched her do it and felt something in my chest go very still and very clear. Before she read a single item, she looked around my living room, the way people do when they're taking inventory without meaning to look like they're taking inventory. Her eyes moved over the sectional David had picked out, the framed photo on the mantle of the 3 of us at the beach the summer before, the small stack of engineering journals David never had time to actually read but kept anyway, like trophies of intentions. I watched her clock all of it, and I watched her decide in real time that the house was worth being polite about. "This is lovely, Maya," she said, "the way you'd compliment a stranger's home at an open house, not the way you'd compliment your daughter's home 9 years after you'd last seen it." I don't think she ever had seen it, not once. Not in the years we scraped together the down payment. Not in the years before the money when this house would have earned a very different kind of comment from her, if she'd bothered to comment at all. "I've been thinking a lot," she said, "about how we can move forward as a family. I think it's important we all put the past behind us." She glanced at the paper. "There are a few things I wanted to talk through. First, I think Theo should meet his grandparents properly, maybe come stay with us for a week this summer so we can really get to know him. Second item," she said, was that she and my father were hoping we might consider helping with some renovations on the house. The roof needed work, and with everything going on with David's company, it seemed like something we could easily help with now. Third, she mentioned, almost as an aside, that Grant's daughter's private school tuition had become a strain, and that, as a family, we might want to help contribute, since we were clearly in a position to. Fourth, and she said this one carefully, like she'd practiced the phrasing, she thought it would be a nice gesture if we set up some kind of trust for the grandchildren, meaning Grant's children, to keep things fair going forward. 4 items. Not one mention of David by name. Not one word of apology for the wedding, for the 9 years, for the baby gift she'd sent to Grant's daughter the same month she'd told me to think it through about mine. Just a list, read in the same tidy, reasonable voice she'd used at that diner 9 years earlier, as though the intervening decade had been a brief unpleasantness rather than a decision she'd made and enforced with total silence. If you've ever watched someone show up only once the math changed, you already know exactly how my chest felt sitting on that couch. Subscribe and stay with me because what I said back is the only part of this story I've been waiting 9 years to tell. I let her finish the whole list. I didn't interrupt, partly because I wanted to hear all of it, and partly because I've learned, from watching David negotiate with investors who thought they could push him around early on, that the person who finishes the sentence usually reveals more than the person who cuts it off. When she was done, she folded the paper back up, like she expected me to simply agree to an itinerary.
Mom, I said.
My voice came out steadier than I expected. 9 years ago, you sat across from me at a diner and told me David wasn't one of us. You didn't come to my wedding. You didn't call when Theo was born. You found out about your grandson through a cousin's Facebook post 3 months after he was born, and you never once picked up the phone. She started to say something about how things were complicated and how your father and I have grown a lot, but I kept going because I'd had 9 years to figure out exactly what I would say if this moment ever came, and I wasn't going to let her steer it. I'm not angry that you're here, I told her, and I meant it, in a strange, clear way. I'm actually grateful because it finally answers a question I've been asking myself for 9 years. I used to wonder if there was anything that would have changed your mind. I used to think maybe if you just spent time with David, met Theo, saw who we actually were, something would soften. Now I know the answer. The thing that changed your mind wasn't David. It wasn't Theo. It was a number in a news article. Her face did something complicated. Not quite guilt, not quite defiance, something in between, the expression of someone recalculating a strategy in real time. That's not fair, Maya, she said. We're still your family. You stopped being the kind of family that gets access to my life 9 years ago, I said. You made that choice. I didn't make it for you. And I'm not going to pretend a folded piece of paper with 4 requests on it undoes a decade of silence. I told her, plainly, that David's company's success wasn't a family fund. That Theo would not be spending a week with grandparents he'd never met, based purely on a stranger's math. That whatever Grant needed for his daughter's tuition was between Grant and his parents, not something my mother got to route through me now that the timing suited her. And that if she genuinely wanted a relationship with her grandson, not access, not resources, an actual relationship, it would start with an honest accounting of what she'd done, not a list. She didn't apologize. I want to be honest with you about that because this isn't a story where the villain has a sudden change of heart. She got defensive. She said I was being cold. She said, your father and I did what we thought was right at the time, a sentence that told me everything I needed to know about how little the intervening 9 years had actually changed her. She tried one more angle before she gave up entirely. She reminded me that she'd raised me, that she'd been there for every skinned knee and every school project and every ordinary Tuesday of my childhood, as though 18 years of basic parental obligation should function as a permanent credit line against any future harm. I gave you your whole life, Maya, she said. Doesn't that count for something? It counted for everything, until the day you decided David counted for less, I told her. You don't get to spend 18 years of ordinary parenting like it buys you a pass on the 9 years after. Those are 2 different ledgers, Mom. You closed the second one yourself. I stood up. I told her, calmly, that she was welcome to leave the way she'd come. I walked her to the door. She stopped on the porch, the same porch, and said one more thing, quieter this time, almost human. I do love you, Maya. I know that's hard to believe right now. I believe you love an idea of me, I told her. I'm not sure you've ever met the actual person. I closed the door. I stood in my hallway for a long moment, listening to her car pull out of the driveway, and I did not cry, which surprised me. What I felt instead was something closer to relief, the specific relief of finally getting a clear, unambiguous answer to a question I'd spent 9 years quietly asking. She called 4 times over the following week. I didn't answer. My father sent one text. Your mother is very upset.
Can we talk?
I didn't answer that either. Grant called, and I did pick up because Grant, whatever his passive complicity had been over the years, had never once asked me for anything. Mom told me what happened, he said. I want you to know, I told her this was coming. I told her years ago this was how it would look if she ever tried to come back only because of money. She didn't listen. I asked him, honestly, why he'd never said any of that to her directly, out loud, at any point in the last 9 years. He was quiet for a moment. Because it was easier not to, he admitted. I know that's not a good answer. It wasn't a good answer, but it was an honest one, and I told him I appreciated the honesty more than I could have appreciated another excuse. I told him that if he wanted a relationship with Theo, that door was open. Theo had done nothing to any of them, and I wasn't interested in punishing a 5-year-old for his grandparents' choices. But it would be a relationship built separately from whatever my parents were doing, on its own terms, not smuggled in under their umbrella. Grant has, to his credit, kept that promise. He's visited twice since then on his own, without our parents. Theo calls him Uncle Grant, who brings the good snacks, which is exactly the kind of low-stakes, ordinary relationship I want my son to have with the family members who've actually shown up. I told David everything that night, sitting at the same kitchen table where he'd once told me about the watch. He listened without interrupting, the way he always does, and when I finished, he didn't say anything about my mother at all. He asked how I was doing. Not how the conversation had gone, not what I thought would happen next, how I, specifically, was holding up underneath all of it. That question told me more about the difference between the family I was born into and the one I'd built than anything my mother had said on the porch. For what it's worth, David said eventually, I never needed them to accept me. I just didn't love watching what it cost you to keep hoping they would. I hadn't fully realized, until he said it, how much he'd been quietly carrying that same weight for 9 years, watching me brace every time a Whitfield family name came up, never once making any of it about himself. Word travels in families the way it travels everywhere, unevenly, usually through the person least equipped to handle it carefully. Within a month, 2 of my mother's sisters had reached out. My Aunt Carol sent a long email that managed to be sympathetic to me and defensive of my mother in nearly the same sentence. My Aunt Diane, the one my mother had always considered the family's more progressive member, sent a single text. She was sorry it had taken this long for anyone to say something, and that I deserved better from all of them. I hadn't expected that one, and it meant more than I let on when I wrote back. A cousin I hadn't spoken to since my wedding reception messaged me out of nowhere to say she remembered exactly what my mother had said about David back in 2018, because she'd overheard it at a family gathering and never forgotten it. She said she should have said something at the time. She hadn't. Almost nobody in my family ever did, in the moment when it would have actually mattered. The apologies, when they came at all, arrived years late and addressed to a version of events everyone had quietly agreed not to examine too closely while it was actually happening. My parents, as of the recording of this story, have not called again. I don't know if that's the end of it. I've stopped trying to predict what they'll do because for 9 years I was very good at predicting it, and being right never once made it hurt less. I want to tell you, honestly, that I didn't set out to make any of this public. I never posted about the porch conversation. I never named my parents online. But Ridgefield is the kind of town where information moves through book clubs and school pickup lines faster than it moves through any actual news outlet, and my Aunt Diane, it turned out, wasn't the only person in the extended family who'd been quietly uncomfortable with what my mother had done for the better part of a decade. My mother sat on the board of a local charity gala committee, the kind of unpaid civic position that mattered enormously to her sense of standing in town. 6 weeks after she showed up on my porch, one of her fellow committee members, a woman I'd known distantly my whole life, mentioned to my mother at a planning meeting that she'd heard the wonderful news about David's company, and asked, with what I'm told was entirely innocent curiosity, whether the family was excited to finally meet little Theo. My mother, according to my Aunt Carol, who was also on the committee and relayed all of this to me later with a particular relish people reserve for gossip they feel guilty about enjoying, went pale and changed the subject immediately. Word doesn't need help traveling in a town that size once the first domino falls. Within 2 months, the story had made its way, in fragments and whispers, through most of the same social circle my mother had spent 30 years cultivating. Nobody confronted her directly. That wasn't Ridgefield style. What happened instead was quieter and, I think, more effective than any direct confrontation could have been. Invitations that used to arrive automatically stopped arriving. A woman my mother had considered a close friend for over a decade began finding reasons to reschedule their regular lunches. The gala committee, the following spring, quietly did not renew her position, citing a need for fresh perspectives, a phrase my mother would have used herself, in exactly that tone, about someone else's downfall. I didn't orchestrate any of it.
I want to be completely clear about that.
I never called anyone in that social circle, never corrected the record, never spread a single detail beyond the people who asked me directly. But my mother had spent 30 years building a reputation on the unspoken assumption that everyone in her orbit shared her particular version of respectability, and it turned out that assumption had never been as solid as she believed. The same silence that had protected her for 9 years worked, eventually, in the opposite direction, once enough people quietly decided they didn't like what the silence had been covering for. If you've ever watched a person's carefully built reputation come apart simply because the truth finally caught up to it, without anyone needing to raise their voice, drop a comment below. And subscribe, because what I finally said to Theo about all of this is the part of the story that matters most to me. People sometimes ask, when they hear a version of this story, whether I regret closing the door as hard as I did. I don't. What I regret, if anything, is how long I left it cracked open in the first place, hoping that patience alone would eventually be mistaken for love. David never once asked me to cut my family off. That was never the price of our marriage. He simply built a life with me that didn't require their approval to be worth living, and somewhere in watching him do that, sell a father's watch to make payroll, work 80-hour weeks with no guarantee any of it would work, and never once let any of it make him bitter, I learned what it actually looks like when someone shows up for the people they love, without conditions attached. My mother's list of 4 demands wasn't really about a roof, or tuition, or a trust fund. It was an accounting of exactly what she decided, 9 years too late, that I was finally worth to her. And I think that's the part one want to leave you with if any part of this story found something true in your own life. Some people will only ever value you in proportion to what you can provide them. The number changes. The math never does. And the moment you stop waiting for them to do it differently is usually the moment you finally get to live the life you were building the whole time, whether or not they were watching. Theo is 6 now. He knows he has a grandmother and grandfather 3 states away that he's never met, and someday, when he's old enough to ask harder questions, I'll tell him the truth, plainly, the way David's mother told him the truth about the father who wasn't there. Not with bitterness. Just with honesty. Some people show up. Some people don't. And the ones who do are the only ones who ever really deserve to be called family. A few weeks after all of this, Theo climbed onto the stool beside me while I was making dinner and asked, out of nowhere the way 6-year-olds ask the biggest questions, why he only had one set of grandparents who came to visit. I sat him down at the counter and told him the truth in pieces small enough for him to hold. I told him that some people find it hard to love others the way they should, and that sometimes that has nothing to do with anything the person did wrong. I told him that Grandma Denise and his cousins on Daddy's side loved him with their whole hearts, and that was the kind of love worth paying attention to. He thought about it for a while, the way he thinks about most things very seriously, and then asked if he could have more grandparents like Grandma Denise instead. I told him I thought that was a wonderful idea, and we left it there because 6 is old enough for honesty and young enough not to need every hard edge of it all at once. I think about that conversation more than I think about the one on my porch. My mother's list of 4 demands was the end of one story, the story of a family I kept waiting to become something it was never going to become. Theo's question was the beginning of a different one, the story of a family we're actually building, on purpose, out of the people who show up without being asked twice. David's mother spends every other Sunday with us now, teaching Theo to sew buttons on his own shirts the way she once taught David, insisting it's a skill every person should have regardless of what any bank account eventually says about them. Aisha brings her own kids over for cookouts in the summer, and our backyard is loud in a way my childhood home never once was. I started seeing a therapist about 8 months after the wedding, back in 2019, long before any of this money existed, back when the only thing I was trying to process was the plain fact that my parents hadn't shown up for the biggest day of my life. Her name is Dr. Renata Osei, and she's the one who first gave me language for something I'd felt for years without being able to name it. She called it conditional belonging, the specific, corrosive experience of growing up believing your place in a family is secure, only to discover at the exact moment it's tested that it was never unconditional at all. It had simply never been tested hard enough, until David. I asked Dr. Osei once, maybe 2 years into our work together, whether I was wrong to keep hoping, for as long as I did, that my parents would eventually come around. She said something I've carried with me ever since. She said hope isn't the problem. The problem is when hope starts costing you more than it's giving back, and you keep paying anyway because you've forgotten you're allowed to stop. I didn't stop paying, not fully, until the day I found out about Theo's birth reaching my mother through a cousin's social media post instead of a phone call. That was the receipt that finally made the cost visible to me. When my mother showed up on my porch with her folded list, Dr. Osei, and I had already spent 6 years working through exactly what a moment like that might feel like, hypothetically, back when it seemed unlikely my family would ever resurface at all. I want you to understand that the calm I felt sitting across from my mother in my own living room wasn't something that arrived naturally in the moment. It was 6 years of therapy, of practicing the sentences, of learning the difference between reacting to my mother's voice and actually listening to what she was saying. The version of me who sat across from her on that couch wasn't performing composure. She'd earned it, slowly, session by session, long before she ever needed it. I also want to say something about David's mother, Denise, because she deserves more space in this story than the role of a supporting character usually gets. Denise didn't just raise David and Aisha on 2 jobs worth of income. She showed up every single time, for every version of our life, long before there was a company or a number attached to any of it. She was in the delivery room when Theo was born, holding my hand through 12 hours of labor because my own mother hadn't returned my call. She drove 3 hours each way, twice a month, for the first 2 years of Theo's life, just to be a grandmother. Not because anyone was watching, not because it earned her anything, but because that's simply who she is. When people ask me now what family actually means, I don't have to reach for an abstract definition. I just described Denise Coleman on a Tuesday afternoon, elbow deep in flour, teaching my son how to make her mother's biscuit recipe, asking nothing of him in return except that he show up for the people he loves the same way, someday, when it's his turn. There's a version of this story where the moral is simply, watch what people do once you have money, and I understand why that's the version people want to tell. It's satisfying. It fits neatly into a single sentence. But I don't think that's actually the truest thing this experience taught me. The money didn't reveal something new about my mother. It just made visible, in a single unmistakable moment, something that had been true the entire 9 years she stayed silent. She had already decided, back at that diner in 2018, exactly how much David and I were worth to her. The money didn't change her calculation. It just finally gave her a reason to act on the answer she'd landed on years earlier, when she thought no one but her would ever have to know what that answer was. That's my story. 9 years of silence, 1 folded piece of paper, and a door I finally closed on my own terms. If this reminded you that love with conditions was never really love at all, take that as your sign today. Drop a comment, tell me what you would have said on that porch, and if someone you know needs to hear this, share it with them. Thank you for being here. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.